Hi, my name's Gene Arnold from TIPCO Jaspersoft. Today we'll be talking about external database authentication. When we talk about external database authentication, here's really what we mean. A user attempts to log into Jaspersoft with a username and a password. That information is then sent to an external database. The external database will look for the username and verify the user's password. If the user is found and the password checks out, the user will be created inside of the JasperReports server. When we actually see this live, I'll explain in more detail what this means regarding a user being created inside of the JasperReports server. So at this point, the username and password checks out and the user has been created. Now the user will be granted access into Jaspersoft and allowed to use the system. In the upcoming example, I have my users stored in a user table. I have the roles for these users stored in another table. And finally, I have a table that describes each of the roles. How you store this information inside your database is really up to you. Later in the demo, you'll see that a query that you build is sent to the database to first return the user information. And then another query constructed by you is sent to return the user role information. As you can see here, all the user and role information is saved inside an external database. JasperReports server will be configured to speak to this external database, allowing external database authentication to happen. At this point, it's time to switch over to JasperReports server and see this all happen live. To start off our example, I'm going to use one of the users that I have stored in my external database to log into JasperReports server. This user is part of organization_2. The username is swood, and I'll enter in that user's password. Now, when I log into JasperReports server right now, I'm going to be logging in as swood, who is part of organization_2, using that user-specific password. This information will be checked against the external database. Just like I mentioned before, if it all checks out, the user will be created inside of JasperReports server. Let's go try this now. Notice in the upper right-hand corner the username swood, just as you would expect. The way I have my JasperReports server set up, users with the role ext_admin are granted admin access within their organization. This is why you see admin functionality available for the swood user. Let's head over to the user section of JasperReports server and see the user's roles and how they've been assigned. From within the Manage Users section of the system, you can see that swood has the following roles assigned. ext_blue. This role was assigned because it's part of the roles assigned to the user from within the external database. Role_administrator. This role was assigned because the role extadmin is assigned to the account from within the external database. My JasperReports server has been set up to map these roles together. You'll see more on this later. Role_user. This is a default role assigned to all accounts created inside of JasperReports server. Regardless of how the user is created inside of JasperReports server, this role is always assigned. Any number of default roles can be automatically assigned to an account when they're created. Now, as you can see, swood is an external user noted by the "This user is defined externally" checkbox. Let's add another user to the organization and see what that looks like. I'll now log into JasperReports server with the user account bwang, who is also part of organization_2. Earlier, I mentioned that users are synced into JasperReports server, and this will be an example of another user synced into JasperReports server, just like user swood was a moment ago. Again, just like before, you can see that I'm logged in as the user bwang, but notice I do not have admin access. This is because this external user does not have the ext_admin role assigned to it in the external database. Since that role doesn't exist with this user, the role_administrator was not mapped over. Now that you've seen external database authentication in action, let's learn how this all works and what's required on your end to set it up. Within your installer directory of JasperReports server, you'll find a folder called external auth-sample-config. The system ships with various authentication setup samples to make implementing authentication easier. For our needs, we'll be choosing the sample-application context-external auth-db-mt.xml file. This file will need to be copied to where JasperReports server is installed. I'll be right-clicking on the file and choosing Copy. With that file copied, we'll need to now paste it in a specific directory within inside of your installed JasperReports server, which is located within inside of your Java Web Application server. I'm using Tomcat for my Java Web Application server. Since I generally have multiple JasperReports servers installed on my system, I name my Tomcat with a specific version name. Your name will probably say Tomcat here, but regardless, you're going to find where JasperReports server is installed, and you'll navigate through this folder directory. You'll want to open up the Tomcat folder directory. Again, mine is JRS_621. You'll then want to move to the Web Apps folder, the Jasper Server-Pro folder, the WebInf folder, and in this location, you'll want to right-click and choose Paste Item, and that will paste the file inside of this folder. Once the file is pasted in this folder, you're going to want to rename it, just like I have mine renamed, to Application Context-External Auth-db-mt.xml. So with the file pasted in the web-inf folder and renamed, we'll be ready to start working on the file and opening it up in our favorite text editor. Now that the file is copied to the proper location and renamed, open it up in your favorite text editor. There are only a few sections within the file that need to be updated to have external database authentication work with JasperReports server. The first section to configure should be around line number 192 and it being labeled External Data Source. This section of the file will handle connecting to the external database. You will need to enter in the driver class name for your specific database server, a well-formatted URL to the database, and finally the credentials that will allow JasperReports server to log into the database and query the user and role information. Now it's time to set up those queries I talked about earlier, which will allow you to gather user and role information. This is done right around line number 72 within a bean called External User Tenant Details Service. The two queries that need to be entered are stored in properties of this bean. The user query is stored in users by username and tenant name query. The roles query is stored in authorities by username query. The user query needs to be configured to return one and only one user. Notice the where clause in my query and the question mark parameter. This question mark will be replaced with the username that is entered into the login screen of JasperReports server. Something very important to note here. The system doesn't care about column names that are returned, but only the order of the fields. The order is as followed: username, password, tenant ID. When you run your query to bring back user information, the fields must come back in this order again: username, password, and tenant ID. The query must return data in this format to work with the out-of-the-box external database authentication tools. If this user query returns a user, then the role query will run. Now the role query needs to be configured to pull back all the roles that the user belongs to. So if the user is part of many roles, there should be multiple rows that are returned. JasperReports server will iterate through the return roles later and do what needs to be done with them. This could be enter them into the system, map them to existing roles in the system, or even skip over the role if the system is configured to ignore that certain role. Now we need to do a little work regarding password and password encryption. This is handled in two beans. First, navigate to a bean called External DAO Authentication Provider, right around line number 67. Here you'll find a property named Password Validator. If this property exists in the bean, then password encryption will be used. If not, or is simply commented out, then plain text will be sent to the database server. The passwords we're talking about here right now are the ones that are being used when a user logs into JasperReports server. Now, if you choose to use password encryption, you can set that up in a bean called Password Validator, located near line number 81. This bean needs to be set up to meet the needs of your company's data encryption policies, and really out of the scope of this video. For testing purposes, I recommend first starting out with clear text and non-encrypted passwords, commenting out the Password Validator property in the External DAO Authentication Provider bean. Let's move to roles and how they're handled. Located near line number 116, you'll find a bean named MT External User Setup Processor. This bean handles roles that have been returned from the database and are assigned to the user. Though rather complex role mapping can be configured here, you'll see in my example that it's pretty easy to set up and can be very helpful and certainly very functional. First, let's talk about the property called Permitted Roles Regex. This property is used to filter out unneeded roles from being entered into the system. A user may have a role attached to them that is needed for another system within your company, but has no reason to be synced into JasperReports server. Using regular expressions, you can configure JasperReports server to only allow in certain roles and leave other roles out. Now let's cover a property called Default Internal Roles. As I mentioned earlier, users can have default roles assigned to them. Simply add the internal JasperReports server roles here, and when a user is created in the system, the roles will be assigned to them automatically. Last but not least, we have role mapping handled in a property called Organization Role Map. This is used to map external roles to internal JasperReports server roles. Notice in my file that when the role ext_green is found, the role _JRS mapped is mapped to that user. And if the role ext_admin is found, the role _administrator is used. This is how the user Wood gained admin rights when logging into JasperReports server. The user has the role extadmin assigned in the external database, so the mapped role of role administrator was assigned inside of JasperReports server. The last section we'll be discussing in this video has to do with organizations and default users. We can start this discussion right around line number 153 in a bean called External Tenant Setup Processor. First, within this bean, you can map organization names if needed. An example of this is located in the Organization Map property. Notice the key value pair for the organization names. My system is configured that if a user has an organization name, also known as tenant ID, of JRS_example, then an organization named example will be created inside of JasperReports server. This comes in very handy when you need to pull in users from multiple organizations and place them within one organization inside of JasperReports server. The last item to discuss is a property named External Tenant Setup Users. In this section, you can configure default users to be placed in your newly created organizations. You can even assign the roles that are added to these users when they're created inside of the new organization. Now that the file is properly configured, save all your changes. At this point, to have these changes affect JasperReports server, you're going to need to stop and then restart the JasperReports server. You can either do that through the Tomcat Web Application Manager or simply just stop your web application server and restart it. Now that you have external database authentication configured, what should you do next? Well, you can create some custom work and get more advanced with external database authentication, but that's pretty much out of the scope of this video. You can also choose to go and theme JasperReports server and make it look any way you'd like. Certainly you'd want to start connecting to your databases and definitely create some amazing content with JasperReports server. If you'd like to learn more about JasperReports server, head on over to the Jaspersoft community. There's lots of great documentation there that you can use to learn more about the product. Specifically, you might want to take a look at the TIBCO JasperReports Server Authentication Cookbook. This file will cover all the information that we talked about today and many other forms of JasperReports Server authentication, all documented in the cookbook. Once again, this is Gene Arnold from Jaspersoft. I really hope you learned something from this video, and as always, thanks so much for watching.